Well, thank you very much, Mark, for the kind introduction and having me again in the conference. I cannot think of any other format that brings together people like we got this morning or yesterday, because either you are in an academic conference and people report from the ivory tower, or you have politicians making politician sound, but the combination of the two and getting a chance to talk freely in one of the most prominent committee rooms in the German parliament, to criticize the government, to say something else about other governments, and to get all the inspiration from Greek thinkers and international law and everything in one conference is quite a privilege. And from time to time, we should be aware of our privileges. So thank you very much for having me and getting the opportunity to talk about Zeitenwende, which, if I listen carefully to what has been said in the morning, is so much smaller, because everyone talked about the bigger picture. And my task that I got from the ICD was to talk about a speech that our new German chancellor gave 2 days after the invasion in Ukraine. And he coined a term, Zeitenwende, which can be translated as turning point, but I prefer to call it Zeitenwende, because turning point refers to something like you go in one direction and then you go into the opposite direction, which is not what it means. It's more like there are new times, and times need to be filled with content and need to be further defined. So I don't want to bother you with German terminology, but I keep it Zeitenwende and not directly translate it into English. And given that we only have 15 minutes left and I don't read and I rather talk about bullet points, I try to be shorter to give you a chance to respond to what has been said, and then we can even go upstairs and take the famous family photo on the roof. The short answer to the question of how does Zeitenwende affect Germany, because the reason why I'm more narrow in my perspective is that this is the Berlin 33, like fall of the Berlin Wall conference, and not like flying and talk about anything in the world and how evil capitalism is or whatever else we need to address this morning, but to think of what happened in this country and how does what happened affect my field of interest, European integration, as something like a context of what has been said before about should Ukraine get a chance to join Western organizations, or who are we to tell them what they should do because we know better. So that is the framework, and the answer to this is I don't know. So I could stop here because things are so much in a flux that there is no one who could possibly give you a precise answer how Zeitenwende should be read and what it does to Germany and the European Union. But I can spend my 15 minutes telling you why I don't know. That's the structure. I talk a little bit, and that's my déformation professionnelle from a sort of methodological point of view, what such terms mean. And then if there is a change of times, we have, of course, to define what the situation before the change is. So what defines the situation after '89 to understand what possible changes will imply, and then for Germany and Europe, and then some smaller conclusions. As I said, the answer is I don't know. So when we listen to what was said in the other building on the other side in the Reichstag on the second day after the invasion, then Olaf Scholz made it as big as the world after the Russian invasion is no longer the same as before. And I thought, what? Because I can think of so many things that are perfectly the same. And even if we feel massively affected by the invasion, we have to understand more specifically what that means in practice. And it reminded me on a similar talk that Angela Merkel gave on the occasion of 9/11, when she said after 9/11 everything has changed. So there's something like a German chancellor reflex that the moment something big happens, you present it as if everything is different now. And that doesn't really help. And we have to try to understand, why do they speak like this? And the one explanation is it's political noise. And political noise helps to frame the world we are in order to legitimize that things will change. And we, the chancellors, are the drivers of the change. And we legitimize what we do because the world has changed. But that doesn't necessarily address everything, although it sounds oversized, like it addresses everything. But it's a political tool to explain that my audience should get ready for a new narrative. And this is the purpose of it. So it's a political instrument. If we in academia would use metaphors like Zeitenwende to narrow down a much more complex picture and nail it down to, there is one expression that explains what the result of our complex findings are, and then we use it as an analytical term, then the analytical term Zeitenwende needs to address what are the constants, like what has not changed and what will change in this concept of a different time. What are the new objectives? Have priorities changed? And if priorities have changed, what are the new strategies to achieve the newly defined goals? And then we could think of, does it help to either help to explain and make sense of what we see, which is, I guess, part of the reason why we sit here and try to better understand the world after 89, 33 years later? Or what are the direct consequences both of the talking, like if Scholz announces something, it doesn't necessarily mean that he also delivers, but then we can compare the announcement and what is actually happening on the ground or decided in the plenary in the other building. So when we first look at where do we come from, then Germany can be portrayed after 89 as a country that defines itself as being embedded in the European Union with little appetite for leadership, which might sound surprising to some of you who are not based in Europe, surrounded by partners, which is a privilege that we don't need to be bothered with things that happen on the edge of the European Union, especially when it comes to migration issues, that we are committed to multilateralism as an alternative to what has been extensively discussed today, how we live in a multipolar world, which first and foremost refers to a legally binding system, because we believe that freedom is for the privileged and law is for the underprivileged, and therefore a system that refers to multilateralism believes in an order in which it's not about power and size and GDP and whether you have nukes, but whether you find a system in which the self-binding commitments serve your interests. And then we in Germany engaged in globalization and benefiting a great deal from a shrinking world in which time and space matters less, which might explain what we have heard about most wars about territory. If territory becomes less relevant in a shrinking world, then you also have less wars about it, which caught us by surprise when suddenly a war over territory happened on European soil, and we thought this is so 20th century. How could one possibly fight over territory, especially if you are the largest country in the world? And that sort of confuses me and still does, because I don't understand what the objectives of this war in Ukraine are. And we can always construct explanations and believe in, well, there is something like an emotional bias because of fears or because big powers have a certain attitude that come from the fact that they are big. But to believe that this is all about territory or this is all about a NATO threat is a narrative that only covers a certain element of a much bigger picture. And to narrow down the complexity of what's happening for the sake of having a simple solution doesn't lead us very far. So what else is going on? What is changing when we look at not only where we come from, but also what Zeitenwende brings or does already bring, is something I mentioned already yesterday in the previous sessions that we had at the ICD, when I asked a question about to what extent things are changing and what it leads to if our business model in Germany is based on cheap security from the US, cheap energy from Russia, and cheap labor that leads to cheap products from China. If all of this is no longer working the way it was, then yes, we face a new situation that can be framed as Zeitenwende. So when we then look at what the new government announced when they signed what is another specialty of Germany, what we call a coalition agreement. There you have bullet points of what a government promises to achieve within the next 4 years, and a lot of it was about changes. So that is already a priority on not continuity, but changes, and they even went as far as promising that if we manage to achieve everything we have listed in our coalition agreement, then Germany will be a different country. And it took less than 100 days, and Germany was a different country, and the Chancellor announced it as Zeitenwende because the world around us has changed, and not necessarily the to-do list has been transformed into legal action. And these are the priorities of the government. We want to address climate change. We want to digitize the German economic system. No one will be left behind. So that's the social democratic part of the mishmash of Greens, liberals, and social democrats. We are committed to a federal Europe. They even went as far as calling it föderativer Bundesstaat, which is something like white milk, and referred to the NATO targets as something that seems to be more important in times of an increasing confrontation even within the continent. And last but not least, we should address our demography and our migration policy that is much more than just asylum policy, because we are competing in the world for the best brains. And that's why we are happy to have you guys here, because if you fall in love with Germany and make an active contribution to make Germany more cosmopolitan and booming, then we can surf on another wave of a cosmopolitan Berlin that is then a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it's not the Germans that make Germany the land of ideas, but the best brains that come to Germany because they think Germany is perfectly cosmopolitan. So what is actually happening aside from announcements? One thing that we see is Germany is much more acting unilateral than one would think, given all these commitments to we are perfectly European and perfectly multilateral. In the most recent history, it was about Nord Stream to sign agreements with Russia because we think we benefit from cheap energy coming from Russia, that after all wasn't that cheap when we compare it with international market prices. We act unilaterally in the so-called migration crisis, which was more a crisis of an incapable infrastructure and not so much a problem of the people who are in need to came here in 1516. We have a pretty special relationship with China if we compare it with other countries' relationship, first and foremost with the United States. And all these unilateral acts make it difficult for our partners to see Germany as a reliable partner. It also changed how we prioritize spending. The announcement of the 100 billion spending on a renewed German armed forces, the Bundeswehr, the 200 billion energy package to make it easier for Germans to deal with the energy shortages in this winter, caused counter reactions in the European Union because not everyone can afford to spend 200 billion euros on a buffer, and an announcement of a massive infrastructure investment to modernize Germany because the previous 16 years of the Angela Merkel government postpone these reforms and make Germany less competitive in a world that is massively based on modernized infrastructure. We also find double standards when we talk on energy, security, and human rights. So on the one hand, we make a big fuss about what's going on with a World Cup that starts next week in Qatar, and at the same time we travel there and ask, can we have a bit more of your gas because we are running out of energy resources? And that makes it difficult to read what we actually say and what we actually do, which makes it difficult to understand what Zeitenwende practically means and how it affects Germany. And last but not least, we do stand united, and I don't know how many times I appeared on international, like non-European media, who ask us how strongly united we still stand, given that there is such a cacophonic orchestra on basically everything, which is not surprising, because if we take diversity and pluralism seriously, then we are different, and our differences lead to a clash of interests. And in the past, we went to war to find out who's right. And in a more cultivated form, like a multilateral system in place, the European Union, we go to committees and cut down the complexity of our problems and digest the conflicts and make them a compromise in an institutionalized process. And this institutionalized process takes everyone seriously, which is why representatives from small countries like Jean-Claude Juncker as the European Commission President, or a non-EU member country like Norway sends important people to important positions, because this is not a power center, this is rather a face and an honest broker position, but it also matters a lot symbolically for small countries to see that even one of us can sit in an important position, and we are not remote controlled by a directorate of Germany and France, or whoever believes that we know better and make the other follow what the big states have to say. So when we then look at the European Union's agenda and how it will be affected by what Germany does or what is happening around us that urgently needs something like change or reform, then we are currently discussing what solidarity means in practice in the European Union. Because if there's a lot happening that asymmetrically affects member states, poorer and richer, periphery and center, those who are directly affected what is happening in Ukraine and those who are lucky to be more located in the West, then we have to find a balancing mechanism that deals with all the expensive challenges that are ahead of us. And that could possibly lead to either new sources of financing that we test currently in the Next Generation EU fund to relaunch the recovery of our economies. And that for the first time was used by an instrument that could be called Eurobonds, that the European Union can borrow money on the secondary markets, but then it turns into something like a community of fate where we have something like a European credit card, and at the end of the day, someone has to pay for the debt. And who this someone is remains to be seen and needs to be discussed. And if it is decided on a European level, then our commitment to be a Western-type democracy asks for accountability. And then the accountability will then lead to the question of what is the parliament that has budgetary rights, and will this parliament elect something like a government? And then one thing leads to another, and we end up in the United States of Europe without asking the European demos, is this actually what you want to see happening? Or are we happy with this hybrid nature that the EU is less than an international organization, is more than an international organization, but less than a state? So this is sort of the bigger framework in which no matter what decision we take, it changes the nature of the European Union. But money is a key question, and we will see more clashes of interests within this united Europe and the united West that stands united against either multipolar challenges, or if we simplify it and put every autocratic regime in the same basket, then it's a bipolar one, but that's more a matter of taste and what kind of metaphors you prefer. But everyone will understand that the nuances make the difference. Then we also need to think about enlargement, and enlargement is radically challenging positions like the one we heard in the morning about if Ukraine will be convinced that their future role is a perfectly neutral one based on the assumption that no one will interfere in the domestic affairs of Ukraine. Then the follow-up question is, can they join a political or an economic organization like the European Union if they think that this is their future to modernize? And if they do, then they buy the whole package of principles, ideals, problem-solving methods, and they perfectly belong to a Western organization that also now defines its security policy with people in uniform in the European Commission. And it's not this shiny, happy civic organization that it once was, as some sort of a burden-sharing model of the United States does the dirty work and sends the cavalry, and we clean up the dishes. This is no longer how it works, because we cannot count on the United States as a reliable security provider if perhaps the next Trump or follow-up Trump is questioning the necessity to have NATO or to do anything for Europe if the future theater is in the Pacific, or what other change of priorities will happen in the White House in the future. We have to address enlargement not only with regard to Ukraine, but also for the other countries that knock on the door, which will change the balance of power within the European Union. And then if the EU is no longer efficient and effective because it has enlarged and more countries make the cacophonic orchestra sound even more cacophonic, then this can turn into something like a core group that shares certain beliefs and interests, which can still promise to be open, but it will lift the bar for everyone who wants to belong to the core group. And then we have something like European integration with first class, second class, third class membership, which radically changes the nature of the beast, which is maybe then more effective in providing what the core group promises to provide, but how it feels to be second class or third class, and whether this is still attractive to belong to a multilateral system in which you are only in the waiting room to one day join the core, also remains to be seen. So with my conclusions, I rather see the Zeitenwende not an analytical description of a clear-cut set of objectives with a clear-cut strategy that we can then evaluate in our master thesis to look into what is happening and what are my conclusions, because there are way too many variables to actually narrow down Zeitenwende as something that can be studied, because it's too poorly defined. What it does is to provide a frame within everything that the government, and including the European governments, will address as something they want to reform and change, or that they have to reform and change because they are to a certain extent condition takers. This is something in which such a new political term makes some sense, because it's proactive and tries to at least promote a certain idea and not just sit and wait what is decided elsewhere, and then we are just reacting and find ourselves being condition takers. The new government also announced that they have a new political style, which I personally doubt they are able to deliver, because the diversity of positions is too big and they don't have enough common denominators. And they also learned from experience that if you are the junior partner, the benefits always go to the chancellor, and the junior partner is only responsible for things that do not work. And in the end, you are marginalized and will lose the next elections and suffer from being the junior partner. So they are currently kicking each other's shins and try to insist on things independently from what is urgently needed for Germany and the European Union. But that's the nature of a coalition government, and I'm afraid we will see more of this happening than what we have seen already in the first year of the 4 years term. To what extent we will learn from previous crises to prepare for more resilience would be another talk, so I skipped this. Whether this will lead to more Europe, as I said, I don't know. it could lead to this because of the external pressure, but that's pure speculation, and we have speculated already a lot this morning, so I don't want to make an active contribution to this. And last but not least, if that leads to more German leadership, which some were demanding, and the German Chancellor was also flirting with the idea, again depends on what we think about leadership. Is this something that Germany will bully others to do what Germany thinks is best? Or if leadership is a euphemism for Germany should pay more, this all is in the eye of the beholder, and I rather stop it here and be curious for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Brückner. Questions and comments, the floor is yours. Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Sergey. I'm from Russia, but currently a Free University Research Fellow in Berlin. And you have spoken in a very, I think, balanced and interesting way about European perspective and Ukraine. But you didn't say anything about Russia. Do you see Russia also as a European perspective? Do you see Russia as European? And what is the perspective for Russia in this European integration in the future? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Thanks.
Do we collect or do we answer?
Sure. Okay. So let's maybe take one or two more. We can collect a few, and then Professor Brückner will respond. Yes, okay.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Anna, I'm a student of ICD. And European Union stands for dialogue and communication, but at the same time, European Union borders are closed for all Russian citizens now, respectless of their position towards the war. And my question is if it's justified by collective responsibility of Russians, or it can bring some negative outcome in terms of development of the war. Thank you.
Is there another question or comment?
Well, we can let you contemplate a bit on your question, and I answer the first two. So, talking about the perspective, the European Union, from the very first beginning, long before it was even called European Union, gave an invitation to every European state to join and apply for membership independently, whether you are rich, poor, located, whatever. There's not even a secret map in the basic treaty that presents a map of who counts as European, because there are no objective criteria. And so the answer, whether Russia is European or not, is to what extent Russia feels European. And we could also turn the question upside down and ask whether the European Union would one day join Russia, because it's way bigger than we are. So it's in the eye of the beholder, and in the very end, it's a political decision. The reason why I haven't talked about it is that I don't know. I neither know what Russia wants, nor I do know what is happening in Ukraine these days, and I also cannot read Putin's mind or what is behind Putin if we assume that this is not the lonesome wolf decision. Today I feel like invading a country, and so I do. I think Russia is far more complex than this personalizing everything in the modern Tsar who can do whatever, and there is nothing that needs to be addressed while we look into the complexity of our institutional setting and see how restricted Olaf Scholz is or the institutions of the European Union. So ideally, in a perfect world, we find an answer to what has been addressed about this not a single inch, like this promise to NATO will not expand further east, because if we find a common denominator, and I also don't understand what the interest of Russia is in the long term, not what happened in the 90s, nor whether the Minsk agreement was actually what they were interested in. Because if we take your argument seriously that it is the attitude of big states, then the attitude of big states don't go away the moment we find a compromise on a single case. because then you still have this as, and I feel like getting bigger or try to expand my territory to another conflict zone, like including the Baltic states, and restore the dignity and pride of the Soviet Union. So given that we don't know this, my ideal world would be that we live in peaceful coexistence and use what the European Union successfully manages in practice to do, that we stay perfectly different, but we are committed in a multilateral system, bind our hands to a certain extent because it's in our mutual interest to benefit from what this multilateral system provides as a public good. So that would be the ideal world. But if you define your interests to the opposite of what this multilateral system provides, then what should be the common denominator? Then you can only clash. And then the use of force because you can undermines the basic assumption of the functioning of a multilateral system. So I don't know what a future government in Russia wants. I would love to see that we find a peaceful coexisting model. And that leads me straight to the question about, shall we take every Russian or every institution in Russia responsible for what the current government decides? This is so short-sighted. And I took my Stanford student on a study trip to Poland, and we met with what they called guests, because they didn't want to call Ukrainians refugees or migrants, because they can go in and out as they wish from Poland. And so we were invited to, or I asked if it's possible to meet Ukrainians, and they said we bring some guests. And we had a conversation with the guests, and they were the most radical people one can communicate with, because they would not make any distinction, no matter if you're here and you openly oppose what is happening there, including Russians that left Russia, I don't know, 20 years ago. I have a Russian Pilates teacher, and she would also be taken responsible because according to the guests, she should go home and fight because this is her moral obligation as a Russian. And I think we pollute the entire common basis for any time after something like a ceasefire or a future relationship in a more institutionalized way if we burn bridges. And if there's anything like what cultural diplomacy is committed to and how we see all of us being agents in this process, then of course we have to distinguish and also give people a chance to apply for asylum, or every Russian soldier who runs away is a Russian soldier who doesn't kill anyone. But in their eyes, this is not possible. They should rather go home and join a resistance movement or whatever, because that is their duty. And that brings us to the stereotypical distinction of, if you have a certain passport, then you have to do A, B, C, D, E. And as I found Huntington's sort of boxing our identities into oversimplifying forms, overly simplifying, because my identity is a liquid one. Sometimes I feel more Bavarian, and sometimes I feel more referring to my masculinity or my Catholic religion, or as a supporter of my favorite soccer team. This changes during the day. So why should I be just a certain nationality or define my identity that this is the core of it, if yesterday I felt more like this and tomorrow I feel like something else? That's the beauty of our freedom and the liberties that have been addressed before, that we can choose who we are. And that can also change over time because of what you currently do. You educate yourself. And by education, you widen your horizon, or you change your point of view, or you expose yourself to something that you never thought about. And by doing so, it also changes how you position yourself in to what extent my identity as my sexuality, my religion, my being a supporter of Barcelona, even if it sometimes feels painful, all of this could be part of something that changes over time. And so being boxed, and you cannot enter a country that is so committed to we are the ones that stand up for human rights and support people in need, is in my understanding, embarrassing. And I'm happy that Germany had a slightly different take on this, but I also understand the emotions and the history and the feelings of countries that lived under Soviet oppression or share a border of more than 1,000 kilometers like Finland, but I don't think it's a very wise and forward-looking decision. Now I even become emotional here.
Is there a final question or comment from the audience? Okay, then if not, I would say let's express first of all our extreme gratitude to Professor Brückner.